The sleazy antique dealer saw my wrinkled hands holding my late mother's jewelry collection and thought he'd found an easy mark. Too bad for him, I've been authenticating and appraising antiques for 40 years, and I was about to give him a masterclass in karma. Before we start, don't forget to like this video, comment where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this. Have you experienced something like this? Please let me know in the comments. My name is Gabriela. I'm 61 years old, and I live in San Francisco, California. And this is the story of how I taught a predatory antique dealer that trying to cheat a retired museum curator out of her family heirlooms was the biggest mistake of his professional life. My mother had passed away 3 months earlier, leaving me her treasured jewelry collection that had been in our family for generations. As a retired curator from the San Francisco Museum of Fine Arts, I knew the pieces were valuable, but I had never taken the time to properly catalog or appraise them myself. They held too much sentimental value, and frankly, I preferred to think of them as family memories rather than monetary assets. But at 61, living alone in my small apartment in the Mission District, I was facing some harsh financial realities. My pension was modest, my savings were dwindling, and the recent rent increases in San Francisco were making it difficult to make ends meet. I had been putting off the inevitable, but it was time to sell some of the jewelry to help with my expenses. I dressed carefully that Thursday morning, choosing my favorite emerald green cardigan over a simple black dress. My red-gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and I wore minimal makeup. I wanted to look respectable, but not wealthy. I had learned from years of working in museums that sometimes it was better to blend in than to stand out. I carefully packed 12 pieces of my mother's jewelry into a small cloth bag. Her Art Deco diamond bracelet from the 1920s, a Victorian gold locket with intricate engraving, a pair of Edwardian pearl earrings, an antique cameo brooch, and several other pieces that I thought might have modest resale value. I avoided bringing the most obviously valuable pieces. I wasn't ready to part with those yet. My plan was to visit several antique shops in the city to get a sense of what the pieces might be worth. I had decided to start with smaller, independent shops rather than the high-end auction houses where I had professional connections. I wanted honest market assessments from people who didn't know my background in the art world. The first shop I visited was called Golden Gate Antiques, located in a narrow storefront in the Richmond district. The window display was cluttered with a mixture of genuine antiques and obvious reproductions, which should have been my first warning sign. But I was approaching this as research, not expecting to make any sales on my first day out. The shop was dimly lit and cramped, with items stacked on every available surface. There was an overwhelming smell of dust and old wood polish. Behind the counter sat a young man who looked to be in his mid-20s, with slicked-back hair and a gold chain visible under his partially unbuttoned shirt. He was scrolling through his phone and barely looked up when I entered. "Can I help you?" he asked without enthusiasm, clearly sizing me up as an unlikely customer for expensive items. "I hope so," I said, approaching the counter with my cloth bag. "I have some jewelry that belonged to my mother, and I'm trying to understand what it might be worth." His demeanor changed immediately. His eyes sharpened with interest, and he set down his phone. "Of course! I'm Joseph, the owner. I'd be happy to take a look." His voice had taken on a warmer, more concerned tone. "I'm sorry for your loss. It must be difficult going through your mother's things." "Thank you," I said, appreciating what seemed like genuine sympathy. "She collected jewelry over many years, and I'm not really sure what any of it is worth." "Well, you've come to the right place," Joseph said with a smile that was starting to feel a bit too practiced. "I've been in the antique business for years, and I specialize in estate jewelry. Why don't you show me what you have?" I opened the cloth bag and began laying out the pieces on the counter. I watched Joseph's eyes carefully as he examined each item, and what I saw concerned me. There was a flash of genuine excitement when he saw the Art Deco bracelet and the Victorian locket, quickly followed by what looked like calculation. He said, picking up the diamond bracelet and holding it up to the light. "This is interesting. Looks like 1920s style, but it's probably a reproduction from the 1970s or 80s. They made a lot of copies during the vintage revival period. I kept my expression neutral, but my professional training was already screaming warnings. The bracelet was definitely genuine Art Deco, with hallmarks and construction details that were impossible to fake convincingly. "What about this one?" I asked, pointing to the Victorian locket. Joseph picked it up and examined it briefly. Victorian style, but again, probably a later reproduction. "The gold plating is wearing off here," he said, pointing to a spot that I knew was actually where the original gold had been worn smooth by generations of wear, a sign of authenticity, not reproduction. As Joseph continued his assessment of my jewelry, I realized I was witnessing a masterclass in predatory antique dealing. Every piece he examined was dismissed as a reproduction, despite the fact that several of them had obvious signs of age and authenticity that any legitimate dealer would have recognized immediately. "The problem with estate jewelry," Joseph said, adopting a tone that was meant to be educational but came across as condescending, "is that most people think their family pieces are more valuable than they really are. The antique market is flooded with reproductions from the mid-20th century when there was a big revival of Victorian and Art Deco styles." "I see," I said, playing the role of confused elderly woman. "So none of these are real antiques?" "Well, they're old," Joseph said generously, "but not old enough to be truly valuable, and the quality isn't quite there for serious collectors." He picked up the pearl earrings, which I knew were genuine Edwardian pieces with natural pearls. "These pearls are cultured, probably from the 1950s. Natural pearls from the early 1900s would be worth something, but these," he shrugged. I was fascinated by his technique. He was systematically destroying the perceived value of every piece while positioning himself as the expert who was helping me understand the unfortunate truth about my inheritance. "What would something like this be worth?" I asked, trying to sound hopeful but resigned. Joseph made a show of calculating, picking up pieces and examining them again. "For the whole lot? In a retail setting, I might be able to get $300, $400 for everything. But I'd have to clean them up, do some research, find the right buyers. And of course, I need to make a profit to stay in business." He paused dramatically. "I could offer you $150 for the entire collection, cash, right now. No waiting, no uncertainty about whether they'll sell." I stared at him, genuinely shocked by the audacity of the offer. The Art Deco bracelet alone was worth at least $3,000, and the Victorian locket was probably worth $2,000. He was offering me roughly 3% of the actual value of the collection. $150? I repeated, making sure I had heard correctly. "I know it's probably less than you were hoping for," Joseph said with fake sympathy. "But honestly, Mrs. Martinez," I said, giving him my mother's maiden name. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm trying to help you here. A lot of dealers wouldn't even make an offer on pieces like these. You might take them to other shops and not get any offers at all." I told Joseph I needed time to think about his offer and left the shop with my jewelry collection intact. But as I walked back to my car, I was already formulating a plan. I had just witnessed a perfect example of elder fraud in action, and I wasn't going to let it slide. That evening, I did some research on Golden Gate Antiques and Joseph himself. What I found was disturbing but not surprising. Online reviews of the shop were mixed, but several one-star reviews told similar stories. Elderly customers who had sold family heirlooms for a fraction of their value, only to discover later that they had been cheated. One review was particularly heartbreaking. An 82-year-old woman had sold her deceased husband's watch collection to Joseph for $200. Her grandson had later seen one of the watches, a 1950s Rolex, being sold online for $8,000, with photos showing Joseph's shop in the background. Another review described a widow who had sold her mother's china set for $50, only to find pieces from the same set being sold in an upscale antique mall for $300 each just weeks later. The pattern was clear. Joseph specifically targeted elderly people, particularly women, who were dealing with estate items. He would lowball them with insulting offers while positioning himself as an expert who was doing them a favor by taking unwanted junk off their hands. I also discovered that Joseph had only been running the shop for about 18 months. Before that, the business had been owned by an elderly man named Frank Castellano, who had run it honestly for over 30 years. Joseph had bought the business from Frank's family after Frank's death, inheriting both the shop's reputation and its regular clientele of elderly customers who trusted the Golden Gate Antiques name. But the most interesting thing I learned was that Joseph had no formal training in antiques or art history. He had no certifications, no educational background in the field, and no credentials, other than owning the shop. Over the next few days, I put together a plan to test Joseph's ethics and document his fraudulent practices. I would return to his shop with a piece that I could easily authenticate, see if he would try to cheat me, and record the entire interaction for evidence. I chose a piece from my collection that wasn't among the items I had shown him before. My grandmother's 1910 Tiffany & Co. silver bracelet. It was a beautiful Art Nouveau piece with the classic Tiffany hallmark clearly visible, and it was worth approximately $1,200. More importantly, it was easily identifiable as authentic Tiffany to anyone with basic knowledge of antique jewelry. I also prepared a small recording device, which I legally could use in California since I would be recording a conversation in a public business establishment. I dressed in the same modest green cardigan and black dress, wanting to maintain the same impression I had made during my first visit. When I entered Golden Gate Antiques 3 days later, Joseph greeted me with the same practiced smile. "Mrs. Martinez, I was hoping you'd come back. Have you thought about my offer?" "I have," I said, "but I wanted to show you one more piece first. I found this in another box of my mother's things." I pulled out the Tiffany bracelet. Joseph's eyes lit up immediately when he saw the bracelet, and I watched him examine the Tiffany hallmark. I could see him recognizing what it was. There was no way to mistake a genuine Tiffany mark if you knew anything about jewelry at all. "This is interesting," he said carefully. "Tiffany style, probably from around 1910. "Is it real Tiffany?" I asked innocently. Joseph paused for a moment, and I could practically see him calculating. He knew it was real. I was certain of that from his body language and the way he was handling the piece. But he also saw an opportunity to add a valuable item to his fraudulent deal. "Well," he said finally, "it has the Tiffany mark, but you have to understand that a lot of pieces were made in the Tiffany style during that period. The mark itself doesn't guarantee authenticity. There were many imitators." This was a complete lie. The Tiffany hallmark was one of the most protected and carefully regulated marks in the jewelry industry, and reproductions with authentic-looking marks were extremely rare and generally obvious to experts. "So it's not real Tiffany?" I asked, looking disappointed. "It might be," Joseph said, "but without proper authentication, I'd have to treat it as questionable. However, it's a nice piece regardless of whether it's authentic or not." He paused dramatically. "Tell you what, if you add this piece to the original collection, I could increase my offer to $200 for everything." $200 for a collection now worth over $7,000. The man had absolutely no shame. "That's very generous," I said, maintaining my innocent elderly woman persona. "You really know what you're talking about when it comes to antiques." "I've been doing this for a long time," Joseph said proudly. "You develop an eye for these things. Most people, especially older folks dealing with estate items, they just don't understand the market." "I can see that. I'm so grateful to have found an honest dealer who won't try to take advantage of me." Joseph's chest puffed up with pride. "That's exactly right, Mrs. Martinez. There are a lot of unscrupulous people in this business who will try to convince elderly customers that their costume jewelry is worth thousands of dollars just to charge huge appraisal fees or take advantage of them in other ways." The irony was stunning. He was warning me about exactly the kind of fraud he was committing while positioning himself as my protector against such schemes. Before I make my final decision, I said, would you mind if I asked about your background? I want to make sure I'm working with a real expert. Of course, Joseph said eagerly. I've been in the antique business for over 5 years. I started as an apprentice with an old-timer who taught me everything about authentication and valuation. I've handled estate jewelry worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Another lie. I knew from my research that he had no formal training and had only owned the shop for 18 months. That's wonderful, I said. And you're confident in your assessment of these pieces? Absolutely. I stake my reputation on every evaluation I give. Perfect. He had just gone on record claiming expertise he didn't have and guaranteeing assessments that were fraudulent. I reached into my purse and pulled out my business card holder. Joseph, I think there's something I should share with you before we finalize this transaction. Of course, what's that? I handed him my business card. I'm Dr. Gabriela Santos, former Chief Curator of European Decorative Arts at the San Francisco Museum of Fine Arts. I've been authenticating and appraising antiques and fine art for 40 years. Joseph's face went through a series of expressions as he read my card: confusion, recognition, and then pure terror as he realized what I was telling him. I specialize in 19th and early 20th century decorative arts, with particular expertise in jewelry and precious objects. I've published 3 books on antique authentication and served as an expert witness in over 50 court cases involving art fraud. Joseph was staring at me like I had just revealed that I was an alien from outer space. The Art Deco bracelet you claimed was a 1970s reproduction, I continued calmly. It's genuine 1920s, with authentic platinum settings and natural diamonds. Current market value is approximately $3,000. Dr. Santos, I think there might be some misunderstanding. The Victorian locket you said was gold-plated reproduction? It's 18-karat gold with hand-engraved detailing typical of 1880s British craftsmanship. Value, $2,000. Joseph was now visibly sweating. The pearl earrings you identified as 1950s cultured pearls are actually natural pearls from approximately 1905, with 14-karat gold mountings. Value, $1,500. I picked up the Tiffany bracelet. And this piece you claimed might not be authentic, Tiffany? It's a 1910 Art Nouveau bracelet from Tiffany & Co., clearly marked with their registered hallmark. Any first-year art history student could authenticate it in 30 seconds. Dr. Santos, I was being conservative in my estimates to protect you from disappointment. Joseph, you offered me $200 for a collection worth over $7,000. That's not conservative estimation, that's fraud. The room was completely silent, except for the sound of Joseph's labored breathing. I could see him trying to figure out how to salvage the situation, but there was nowhere to go. He had been caught red-handed trying to defraud someone he thought was a vulnerable elderly woman. But more importantly, I continued, I've been recording our entire conversation. I have documented evidence of you deliberately misrepresenting the value of authentic antiques with the intent to defraud an elderly customer. Joseph's face went from red to white. You can't record people without their consent. Actually, California is a two-party consent state for private conversations, but this is a place of business open to the public. However, that's irrelevant because I'm not planning to use this recording with law enforcement. You're not? No, Joseph. I'm going to give you an opportunity to make things right. I pulled out my phone and showed him the reviews I had screenshot from his business page. I found 12 other customers who have posted reviews describing experiences very similar to mine. Elderly customers who sold family heirlooms for a fraction of their value after you convinced them the pieces were worthless reproductions. Joseph's face went from red to white. You can't record people without their consent. Actually, California is a two-party consent state for private conversations, but this is a place of business open to the public. However, that's irrelevant because I'm not planning to use this recording with law enforcement. You're not? No, Joseph. I'm going to give you an opportunity to make things right. I pulled out my phone and showed him the reviews I had screenshot from his business page. I found 12 other customers who have posted reviews describing experiences very similar to mine. Elderly customers who sold family heirlooms for a fraction of their value after you convinced them the pieces were worthless reproductions. Joseph was now staring at me with a mixture of fear and hatred. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to contact every one of these customers and offer to buy back their items at fair market value. Where that's not possible because you've already resold the pieces, you're going to compensate them for the difference between what you paid and what their items were actually worth. I can't do that. Do you know how much money that would be? I do, actually. Based on the descriptions in these reviews and my knowledge of antique values, I estimate you owe your previous customers approximately $45,000 in additional compensation. Joseph looked like he was about to faint. The alternative, I continued, is that I contact the San Francisco District Attorney's Office, the Better Business Bureau, and the California Department of Consumer Affairs. I'll provide them with my recording of our conversation, my professional assessment of your fraudulent practices, and a detailed report on your pattern of elder fraud. You can't prove I did anything illegal? Joseph, I can prove that you deliberately misrepresented the value of authentic antiques with intent to defraud. I can prove that you claimed expertise you don't possess. And I can prove that you have a pattern of targeting elderly customers with the same fraudulent scheme. You can't prove I did anything illegal? Joseph, I can prove that you deliberately misrepresented the value of authentic antiques with intent to defraud. I can prove that you claimed expertise you don't possess. And I can prove that you have a pattern of targeting elderly customers with the same fraudulent scheme. I leaned closer to him across the counter. More importantly, I can make sure that every antique dealer, auction house, and collector in Northern California knows exactly who you are and how you conduct business. The antique community was smaller than most people realized, and reputation was everything. If I put the word out that Joseph was a fraud who targeted elderly customers, he would never be able to work in the legitimate antique business again. What do you want me to do? He asked quietly. Start with Mrs. Chen, the woman who sold you her husband's watch collection for $200. You sold one of those watches for $8,000 according to her review. You owe her $7,800. I don't have that kind of money. Then you better figure out how to get it. You made your money by cheating elderly people out of their family treasures. Now you're going to make it right. 3 weeks later, I received a call from Mrs. Chen. She was crying, but they were tears of relief and gratitude. Joseph had contacted her and paid her $7,800 for the watches he had purchased from her for $200. She told me the money would allow her to pay for her husband's memorial service that she had been unable to afford. Over the next 2 months, I received similar calls from other elderly customers Joseph had cheated. He had contacted each of them and made financial restitution for the difference between what he had paid and what their items were actually worth. The total amount he paid out was $47,000, money that went back to elderly people who had been cheated out of their financial security. Joseph closed Golden Gate Antiques 6 months later. I heard through the antique community grapevine that he had left San Francisco entirely and was working in retail sales somewhere in Nevada. The building that housed his shop was taken over by a young woman named Clara Rodriguez, who had recently graduated from UC Berkeley with a degree in art history. She reopened it as Castellano Antiques, honoring the original owner who had run an honest business for 30 years. Clara asked me to serve as a consultant to help her authenticate pieces and ensure fair pricing for her customers. I agreed, and I now spend 2 afternoons a week at the shop, helping to make sure that elderly customers get honest evaluations and fair prices for their family treasures. As for my mother's jewelry collection, I kept most of it, but I did sell the Tiffany bracelet to Clara for exactly what it was worth, $1,200. She sold it to a young woman who was thrilled to own an authentic piece of early 20th century American craftsmanship. The Art Deco bracelet, the Victorian locket, and the other pieces remain in my family where they belong. But now they're properly documented and appraised, and I've created a detailed provenance record for my nieces who will inherit them someday. Sometimes people ask me if I feel bad about ruining Joseph's business. The answer is no. I feel bad that it took so long for someone to stop him. Elder fraud is a serious crime that destroys not just financial security, but trust and dignity. Joseph preyed on elderly people during some of the most vulnerable moments of their lives, when they were dealing with the death of loved ones and the overwhelming task of settling estates. He stole not just money, but irreplaceable family heirlooms that carried generations of memories. The best revenge isn't just stopping a predator. It's making sure their victims get justice. And sometimes the most effective way to do that is to use the very expertise they tried to exploit against you. That's the end of my story. Have you ever dealt with someone who tried to take advantage of your age or assumed lack of knowledge? Share your experience in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe. I share stories like this every day because everyone deserves to be treated with honesty and respect, regardless of their age or circumstances.